Rock and roll. All right. Good morning, Gary. Thank you for joining me today.
Morning. Good to be here.
So, Gary, you work with Operation Underground Railroad, right?
That's right.
Awesome. So, tell me a little bit about that. I came across Operation Underground Railroad um, in the start of Dad Bod Fitness. Someone I was working with, we were talking about a charity that kind of lines up with the values of what we do here at Dad Bod Fitness. And when I found out more of the details about Operation Underground Railroad, I instantly fell in love with it. So, I mean, you're a little more of the expert in the field regarding that. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Operation Underground Railroad exists to rescue and rehabilitate children from sex trafficking. So, I always preface this a little bit with the fact that this is a dark topic. It's not the easiest thing to discuss and talk about, but it is a reality and it is happening. There's actually more people in modern day slavery than there have ever been in the history of the world, and we go into the what I consider to be the darkest places of humanity to rescue these kids and then make sure that they have aftercare services for their healing journey.
Yeah, that definitely is a pretty dark topic that most people don't typically talk about, or isn't something that most people are aware of with
Right.
respect to that as parents, and just being fortunate enough to live where we are and not see a lot of this happening. And to an extent, we could kind of think like ignorance is bliss, but and not really having that awareness. How long has our been active for?
So this is our seventh year of operation, and we were founded by a man named Tim Ballard. And Tim spent about 12 years in the Department of Homeland Security as an undercover agent, and his role actually with the department was to infiltrate and break up child sex trafficking rings. We get the question a lot, like, well, if he was doing that in the department, why was there a need for him to start a nonprofit? And one of the reasons was is that part of his sub role in the department was to actually consult with other governments and teach them best practices, what's working in the U.S., what's effective in helping them break up these infiltrate and break up these sex trafficking rings. And on a couple of his consultation trips, he's meeting with special agents of other countries, federal police of other countries, and actually going through a PowerPoint slide and teaching them about what tactics to use and what's successful. And the issue is that in doing that work, Tim would find kids relatively easy being trafficked, but he couldn't actually do anything about it because there's no U.S. jurisdiction or nexus to that case or to those kids. And
Hmm.
and he saw the infrastructure that existed within these countries and what they were able to do, and realized that they don't really have the resources and technology in a lot of cases to actually go after these kids. And if the U.S. can't go after these kids, then who will? And over time, that became this unacceptable reality that there were kids that nobody was going after. So Tim envisioned this public-private model where you could a nonprofit could sort of operate fluidly across state lines, fluidly across country lines, and supplement law enforcement in these areas. And so we send operators, we send technology, we send trainings with best practices to 29 countries around the world, and we actually have operators going undercover in those places to find these kids, liberate them, and then of course provide aftercare for them.
How long does it take to get something like that set up? It seems like when you're working for Homeland Security, you have a pretty cushy job and you're going from something, the US government with a wealth of resources attached to them, and then, all right, you know what? Like, I want to do more. I can't do it here. I need something that's going to give me a little more freedom. You leave that, but then you're leaving. I mean, sure, you have those connections, but you're leaving with nothing essentially. So to get these operations set up, immediately get back in touch with other governments and other countries around the world. You're not like saying, "Hey, it's Homeland Security, hi, it's Tim with Operation Underground Railroad."
Right.
So for
Yeah.
hour to get established, it's like, who is this guy calling the government here? You know what I mean? So how long did that take before our became reputable and was able to make a difference?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's still a work in progress. I mean, 29 countries sounds like a lot, but this happens in nearly every country in the world. There's trafficking reported in all 50 states in the U.S. So we have a long way to go, and it does take a considerable amount of time to establish that credibility in those relationships. Thankfully, our operators are. I mean, their performance speaks for itself. And a word of mouth is huge in this industry, and so I would argue that our reputation is sort of what allows us to expand and go into these other places. So. But of course, that takes time. I mean, that's a really insightful question. It might sort of be easy to think that, like, okay, this problem is so huge and it's everywhere, and so let's get as many groups like ours involved and going and all this kind of stuff. But it is very complicated. It's a very complicated issue, and it takes time to develop trusting relationships, particularly in countries where trafficking is generational. And sometimes, unfortunately, this is sad, but law enforcement is involved in that process, particularly local law enforcement. And so we have to establish the right relationships that are going to allow us to be effective and impactful. And the other piece of that is that we're not vigilantes. I mean, we don't go places that we're not invited, and that there's a sort of an overarching purpose to that, which is we want to make sure that when we do these investigations, when we put on these sting operations, when we make arrests, that's actually going to stick, right? So we have to follow whatever prosecution laws exist in those countries and make sure that those guys actually end up behind bars. And so there's a right way to do it, and there's sort of a roughshod way to do it. Of course, we're talking about kids and providing hope for them. We have all the emotions that you could imagine. Most people feel when they start hearing about this issue. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we do things in the right way that actually ends up with perpetrators being arrested and prosecuted and serving time.
So I guess the movie Taken is a little bit of an embellishment for one's
Yes,
reaction.
yeah, and actually, it's ironic that you bring that up. I use that example a lot, particularly here in the U.S. A lot of people envision that kind of taken movie as a conveyance of what trafficking is like, and it does happen that way. But particularly here in the U.S., it's much more of a psychological captivity. I think this is probably I'm relatively new to the space. I work with some amazing heroes and people here in this organization and with other groups that have put decades into this work, and so I'm a little baby compared to them, and I'm just
Mhm.
soaking up everything I can. One of the things I'm learning is the stark contrast between trafficking here in the U.S. and some of the other third world developing countries that you see around the world. And in the U.S., it's much more psychological. And to give you an example of that, you have vulnerable teens, for example. Maybe they just went through a breakup. Maybe they're having mental health issues, and we've all been teenagers, right? Who can't say at some point in their life that they had a downturn, and these what are called Romeo traffickers are very clever in the sense that they know how to target these individuals, shower them with attention and gifts, boys and girls, and create this sort of false relationship. And then all of a sudden they're garnering images or videos from them, and then they hold that as leverage over them. They say things like, I'm going to tell your pastor, your parents, your teachers what you're doing unless you continue to do this with my friends, or do these things with me, and I'll post them online and sell your images. So it's pretty disgusting. But you have teenagers who are seemingly living normal lives, but they're actually being trafficked, and they're going to school every day. And on the nights and on weekends, people around them in their circle have no idea what they're experiencing. And so 85% of trafficking cases in the US actually start online. So it's a big topic of discussion. It's a lot of work we do in the US is online. So we have technology that monitors chatter on the dark web. We can identify where, IP addresses where child pornography is being distributed and created and sold online. And so we identify those locations, and then we set up operations to catch those guys and to make sure it stops. So that's a lot of the work we do in U.S. and that maybe looks a little bit different sometimes than what you see in the media about how trafficking actually takes place.
In the U.S., are there particular states where this happens like more than others? Are these types of crimes and incidents more focused towards certain areas of the country, or it's just somewhat equal state to state?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's equal state to state, per capita maybe, and there's we rely on sort of federal um, organizations to gather that information. First of all, this is a crime, so it's probably underreported in a lot of cases. These are just tips and cases that are kind of compiled and extrapolated. We found that any city that has two major intersecting state highways is prevalent for trafficking. So to answer your question, it's I mean it's everywhere. I mean you see it a lot in along the I-10, I-20 corridors,
Hmm.
I-5 in California. It's prevalent in the Northeast, and South Florida is a sort of a hotbed. But really, I mean, it's happening in every state, and you can Google, you know, human trafficking cases or arrests, and you'll see it. I mean, there was cases in Minnesota recently, several, dozens of traffickers arrested. When we partner with law enforcement and when we put on these sting operations, I mean, sometimes we're talking about small counties that we work with. And unfortunately, it's just terrible to see how many people we're actually able to catch either wanting sex with kids or providing it. And it's horrific. I mean, and by the way, if you talk to law enforcement, it's not, sometimes we get the question like, well, why isn't this prioritized? Why isn't this, um, you know, why isn't this all any law enforcement agency is working on? And it's really not a lack of desire, it's a lack of bandwidth. And that's exactly why O.U.R exists, to provide them with operators should they need it, technology, training. We have canine, electronic device detection canines that actually can help us find evidence. And they've led to over 100 arrests of pedophiles
Jeez.
and traffickers. So there's lots of different ways that we supplement those efforts so that we can sort of stand in the gap and help them combat those issues in their own community.
What is it about those interstate highways that you mentioned? Those like you mentioned where uh sorry, I'm having trouble just figuring the what was it that you mentioned? Where the like locations that they
Yeah,
tend to
so
happen where
any
different states
any
cross?
city that has two major intersecting state if you were to look at a map, the map of the U.S.,
Yeah.
and you see where I-10 meets I-45, or where I-20 meets I-45. I know because I'm from Texas; those are the two
Sure,
state
sure.
highways I'm familiar with. But anytime you see those two major intersecting highways, there's trafficking that's prevalent in that city. I guarantee.
But what is it about the intersecting highways? What is
So,
it about?
so a lot of traffickers will move their they would consider them commodities. Will move their you know the people that are in their captivity. They'll move them around to different to sort of a network of cities, and they're always on the move. Always. I hate to use this terminology callously. I just because these are people we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, these women and girls that they're trafficking, they'll move them around to different locations and cities, and typically highways are how that transportation happens. So these are cities that create demand for trafficking. The U.S. is the highest demand for child pornography out of any country in the world. I mean, I was shocked when I learned that. We're the demand. By the way, our operators are so successful in these other countries because the Western male is who these traffickers are used to seeing traveling to these other countries and wanting sex for kids. That's why they fit the persona. And so, a lot of people don't understand that we're the ones that are actually creating the demand. The U.S. is the third highest nation for victims to be trafficked into.
What are the other two?
I don't know off the top of my head. I just care a lot about the U.S. and
No, of
and
course. I mean, hey,
the
look,
stat.
this is where we live. This is where we have kids, and our family members' kids, and I mean, you see this a lot more than the average person, and you see the reality of it a lot more than the average person. So I'm sure this hits a lot closer to
Yeah.
home. Now, when you mention in the U.S., it's much more psychological. In other countries that you deal with, what's the typical scenario over there? How is it typically? What typically happens compared to here?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you kind of cut out a little bit. You said what happens internationally?
Yeah, over here you mentioned that it's a little more psychological forcing
Hmm.
and getting into the mental game of
Yeah.
the victims that are of the victims.
Hmm.
So compared to internationally in other countries, what typically happens there to the victims
Yeah, so
relative to here?
you see a lot of fake job ads. So if you can imagine, in certain countries, there's areas of that country or cities that just have a lot more economical, prevalence than other areas of the country, and so it's not uncommon for people to travel to those cities for work, right? And so what happens is you have these fake job ads, to be a model, or to be a waitress, or something along those lines, to work in a club. And there's paperwork, there's documentation, there's seemingly legitimacy to these operations. And then when these individuals get to those cities, their documents are taken. If they're traveling
Oh,
across
yeah.
countries, their passports are taken, and so they literally have no way of getting out of that situation. They're beaten if they try to leave, and that's how a lot of these individuals end up in captivity. We just worked a case several months ago where there were 11 survivors. They were in one of the most horrific situations that we've actually encountered. I mean, literally almost in the back of a old jail, and they're literally behind bars. They're being trafficked, dozens of times a day. Uh,
Jesus.
and what happened was, and some these women were, one of them was an accountant, one of them was like a trained in as a clinician, and so it's not like they're uneducated and can't find work for themselves, sort of thing. But because of macroeconomic issues in the country that they're from, they were looking to other surrounding countries for work, and so they saw a job ad, and things seemed legit. They got there, their passports were taken, and all of a sudden, for years, they were trafficked. O.U.R. put on a sting operation, arrested the traffickers. We were able to get the survivors out, and we were able to get them visas. They're getting their English language certifications here in the U.S. We're providing other vocational trainings for them, and we're in the process. Some of them still have not seen their children, and we're in the process of getting them reunited with their own kids. So these are young women who were lured into this, and it's just because they were caught in a vulnerable situation in their life financially that they ended up in this terrible situation, and they were just manipulated and taken advantage of. So we see a lot of that internationally. And then in some countries, unfortunately, like Haiti would be a great example. You have fake orphanages, and when there's a lot of desperation and no sort of economical out in those countries, you see that trafficking is rampant and prevalent.
So in an instance like you just mentioned, how does OUR find out about something like this? Like you mentioned this was happening for
Hmm.
years where they were victimized. How how do you guys get wind of this? And before I forget this next question, what's the rehabilitation process like for someone who just endures that kind of
Yeah.
trauma for so many years?
Yeah, so you might have to remind me, Ori, because I might forget both of those questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, how does O.U.R. catch wind or like learn where trafficking might be happening? So We have we our operators don't just exist here in the U.S. or any other country for that matter. We actually have operators that live full time, that understand the culture in the places that they work, and so they have connections and relationships. Also, our relationships with law enforcement or federal police or whoever it is that we're working with in these other countries, and whenever they get a tip or whenever they're doing recon and they see something and they investigate something, that's when O.U.R can put a team together and is asked to go participate in those situations. So we have teams it's not like we only just like go into a country, do an operation, and then come back home. We have teams that actually
Yeah.
live in those areas, and so they're all that's their job. 100% of the time is to investigate these situations and find those leads. So typically that's where they derive. We've had situations though, I don't know, call it luck or whatever you want to call it, divine intervention, where we are just, we're working in an area, we're doing recon, and while we're there, this happened just recently. While we're there, we get a tip from law enforcement there, and we just happen to have gringos on the ground that can go undercover and lure out these traffickers. And so we were just doing some work in Central America, and we caught a American pedophile that was wanted in several countries, and it was,
Jeez.
I mean, it was just lucky. It was just lucky. We just happened to be, doing the work that we feel like we're called to do, um, that tip came in while we had operators there on the ground. And what was crazy is that we learned through going undercover and actually just developing a relationship with this guy that he was about to move, and if he would have moved to another city there in that country, who knows? I mean, maybe we would have never found him. So we actually were able to separate two girls from his captivity that are now in aftercare. So
You said he was American. Was he extradited back to the U.S. or is
yeah,
he just
so
penalized under?
actually, it looks like he's going to serve two sentences. So he'll serve a sentence there locally, which is probably much worse for him. And then if he ever does make it back to the U.S., he'll have to serve time here as well. So your other
While we're on
question
that
was,
topic,
oh, go ahead, yeah.
I feel weird asking this question. Not weird asking this question, but like, for someone who does that kind of shit to kids, do you feel a prison sentence is enough? As a dad, me hearing that, and it just kind of like makes my skin crawl. And you're thinking like, is it really justice? Would these people who inflict this kind of harm get?
Yeah, I think I think I'm probably I'm not sure that anyone really has the authority to fully
N- Of course not.
judge on that. I think that, but I understand where you're coming from. Let me just say that.
Yeah.
And we get the question a lot, like, why do we not just jump over the table and strangle these guys? And like, I mean, we don't necessarily sort of get into the nitty gritty very much what I'm about to tell you, but um, our operators have to become those people. They have to say those things in order to gain trust and get
Yeah.
evidence, right? And so um, you know, they're having to pretend to um, enjoy having those conversations and actually want those sort of things. And so it takes a toll on them, because they are incredible and amazing and wholesome people that would never even think about being in a situation like that. A lot of this, we deal with a lot of addiction, and that's something that we have to remind ourselves too, that there are just these people have sex addictions, and I'm not saying that's an excuse for them. I'm just saying that I mean, this guy, like, let's use this guy in this country we're working in as an example. This is horrific to think about, but he could have just not not done anything. I mean, like, it's not like anybody knew where he was, but he could not help
Yeah.
himself. He had to continue hurting these kids, and I think that's why it's so important that these guys actually get put away. It's said that a pedophile will harm between 100 and 200 kids in their lifetime. And so
Jeez.
OUR has rescued over 4,800 survivors. We've arrested more than 2,600 pedophiles and traffickers, and we care for more than 6,000 people in aftercare. So that, we don't really care about the statistics, but when you think about the 2,600 individuals who've been put behind bars, how many kids are not going to ever experience what some of these other kids experience? That, I mean, that's really important to us, right? That we
Of
that
course.
we stop that from continuing to happen. So is it enough? I don't know, but it's what we can do. It's the best thing we can do right now, and we're gonna keep doing that. We're gonna keep making sure that we get these kids separated from these individuals, and the operators will tell you the reason why they don't reach over and strangle these guys or whatever, although they certainly want to, um, is because it's not what's best for the kids.
I meant more in the after sense, like I guess I'll just use you know Larry Nasser.
Mm-hmm.
He was the
Mm-hmm.
gymnastics physio, I think. Uh, during the court case, I remember there was this image like where a dad tried to like approach him when he was on the stand, and the dad and the dad of one of the victims ended up like getting arrested over there because he
Yeah.
tried to assault Larry Nasser.
Mm-hmm.
I meant it more in terms of after the fact. I understand what you meant with
Yeah.
that. So when you mentioned the aftercare, going back to that previous question, the
Mm-hmm.
rehabilitation, what is that process? I mean, I understand that every individual is a little bit
Yeah.
different. Some definitely can cope and handle things better than others. But what does that process typically look like? How do these victims get reacclimated into their previous lives or back into society? What's it like when they're reunited with their families? Um, and so forth.
Yeah, great questions. And it's not so much that sort of anyone's ability to cope. It's just more about what any particular survivor has experienced and what's going to be the best course of care for them. And the fancy industry term for that is trauma informed care. So that means that whenever a survivor is rescued, we've put together a plan for them that is informed by what they've experienced and what they've been through and what's going to be best for them to be on their healing journey. And so it looks like really all sorts of things. We partner with a lot of different types of aftercare homes. You have crisis intervention, which is typically like 48 to 72 hours. A lot of times these kids, they can't even process information in the same way that most people can because of the trauma they've experienced. And so we use things like sensory modulation to calm them down and get homeostasis, and so that they can actually start receiving care. We have short-term inpatient aftercare facilities. We have long-term outpatient aftercare facilities. I think probably the easiest way to answer that question is that we are committed to every survivor through adulthood and then sometimes even beyond that if they want to go to college or if they want to learn some kind of trade skill. So that's a huge commitment that we make as an organization. A lot of people know us perhaps for our rescue missions, but we really focus on aftercare as well. It's such a huge important piece of this, and our operators will tell you that getting the kids out is the easy part. It's the aftercare that takes effort and work and really dedicated people. We have an amazing aftercare team. They literally travel 24/7 to every single country we do work in. They visit our survivors. They visit the facilities. They assess what are needs here, and then O.U.R. can do work to get those needs funded and make sure that those kids are taken care of. So it's clothing, it's food, it's shelter, it's different types of therapies, it's counselors, it's psychiatric care, equine therapy, art therapy, music therapy. All these things kind of come together and surround the survivor with things that they're going to need to thrive. Not just survive, but actually work through some of the trauma that they've experienced. And um, it's unfathomable. I mean, it really is. Like most people cannot understand how difficult that path is and how challenging it is. And so you just have you we get to celebrate everything. I mean, every point of progress that a survivor achieves, we are in full celebration for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little speechless at that, just because, like you said, most people don't understand, and I I don't offhand, and it's something I think most people should try to learn and become more aware of, and figure out ways that they can help out. When you guys do get wind of these situations and you realize, all right, we need to get some type of extraction mission going and compile evidence, how long does that typically take? The previous example you said was, these people were victimized for like 12 years, was it?
No, a couple years. Yeah, a
But
couple.
from when you guys get wind of a situation and you're like, all right, we gotta get stuff together, we gotta get someone in close to them. How long do those undercover missions take?
Yeah, it can take weeks to months. It can happen as quickly as a few days. It just. I mean, every situation is a little bit different. It depends on how much intel we have. It depends on how much we know about the situation. We want to make sure that we identify as many survivors as we can in that situation, and identify individuals who are involved. I mean, sometimes I don't necessarily always want to use an example from Hollywood, but sometimes what these guys are doing is very much like what you might see in The Departed, where you're kind of you're infiltrated into that network, and you're gathering context and gathering intel. And like I said, so, some of these guys live in these areas, and that's what they do all the time. They're constantly gathering that intel and going after leads.
Are there some countries where, like, you see this? You're involved in 29. OUR is involved in 29 countries at the moment. Are there, like, some countries where you'll see this going down a lot more? I know you mentioned the orphanage in Haiti, that was a ring for trafficking. Do you tend to see this in certain parts of the world much more than others?
Yeah, we do a lot of work in Southeast Asia. We do a lot of work in the Middle East. Sometimes there's, political or even factions at play that really lead more, to more trafficking situations, and slavery in general. And so, yeah, we do a lot of work in those places. We do a lot of work in Central Africa. We do a lot of work in South America and Central America. I mean, sometimes our I guess volume of work is driven by the strength of relationships in those areas. So, but we're always looking to expand that, and operate in as many places as it's possible for us to do that. And we're a completely privately funded organization. So, one of my favorite things is connecting with organizations like yours, and you guys are stepping up and saying, we're going to take ownership of the situation. We're going to create awareness. We're going to create resources, and that's exactly what we need to be able to do more of the work that we're doing. And I'm grateful that we've established the partnerships we have in these places, so that once we have those resources, we don't wait. We send teams out, and we get stuff done. So that allows us, that facilitates that work for us.
That's awesome. Well, how long have you been involved with OUR?
So I've been here for a little over a year now. I've been following O.U.R. for over 3 years. So I came across Operation Underground Railroad. I stumbled across a documentary, Operation Toussaint. Maybe you've seen it. Toussaint. It's free on YouTube. So anyone who's listening, feel free to look that up. But yeah, it's looking back 3 years ago now, I can see in hindsight that it just totally changed the trajectory of my life. I mean, I worked in for-profit, I worked for healthcare, had a great career, great people that I worked with, but I just felt like a higher calling. And so when the opportunity to join up with O.U.R. presented itself, we sold our house in Texas, and hit the road, so to speak, and we've been all in ever since.
Did you have kids at that point when you
Yeah.
first came? So was that? Do you think that was a little bit of a motivator for you, kind of just taking an inward look, and seeing how something like this could potentially affect your family, and how you never want to see something like that?
Yeah, I mean, to be completely honest with you, I can't. I don't allow myself maybe to fully like imagine what it would be like if one of my own kids was caught in that. My kids are really young. I think maybe that helps as well. So maybe this is like uh, terrible thoughts I have to look forward to in the future. But I just try not to even put my kids in that situation. I just don't think I can handle it, to be honest with you. But yeah, I mean, of course, it's motivating, and I think. I mean, I think even if I know a lot of people who do this work who don't have kids, and they're just as motivated because when you see um, when you see the hope that it's possible to provide a survivor who's been living in hell on earth. I mean, I sometimes we sort of get motivated by anger or frustration or just plain like desperation and sadness about what's happening. What I find to be equally motivating is that you know organizations like O.U.R are actually providing hope for these survivors and providing a way out where that didn't exist before. And so I think that is equally motivating, and it's something that we try to also focus on when we do this work. Maybe out of necessity, because if we only just focused on all the horrific things all the time, uh, maybe we just wouldn't be able to keep going. But we also focus on that light, the light that O.U.R aspires to be in other organizations like us.
How many other organizations are there that do, similar things to OUR? And do you guys ever like partner with them for collaboration? Be like, hey guys, this is going down over here. We need some backup, or
Yeah,
something along those lines.
yeah, you find that once you get into the industry, it's a kind of a small world, and so we work with a lot of other organizations. It's a penalty. We did a campaign with them around the Super Bowl this year. We've worked with Agape International Missionaries. We've worked with International Justice Mission. So there's a lot of other organizations that we partner with, particularly overseas because they have information, they have intel, they have tips, and we all kind of bring something a little bit different to the table. I would say what makes O.U.R niche is our law enforcement relationships and our ability to be a part of the investigation and prosecution process, which is important to us. So that's an element I think that we an element of expertise that we bring to the table. We have our operators, a lot of them are either current law enforcement or retired law enforcement. Our chief director of international operations has over 35 years in
Wow.
the Department of Homeland Security. Obviously, Tim's experience there. Our director of domestic operations just retired after 20 years in law enforcement, and so he has a lot of relationships, and all of these guys worked anti-trafficking cases and child sex trafficking cases. So their expertise goes a long way, and that's what I
Yeah, they were all pretty much subject matter
yeah, that's
experts.
what I meant by the fact that guys like you and I have so much to learn from these guys and their experience and their tactics. So yeah, that's something sort of unique that O.U.R brings to the table, and then we have again I can't say I mean again I find myself kind of talking a lot about our law enforcement side, but our aftercare side is incredible. I mean, we just that this team, they're the best. They're the best. Uh, After our senior manager of aftercare just got his master's in anti-trafficking initiatives. So they're always learning, they're always finding what's going to be best for these survivors and building those relationships around the world so that we can provide that care.
As far as your situation with OUR goes, have you ever traveled internationally on certain cases as well and seen these things firsthand, or been involved in some of the apprehensions and rescue missions?
Yeah, so my team has been allowed to participate a little bit on the op side and on the aftercare side. We kind of stay out of the way in most cases, but I think it is enlightening and sometimes shocking to see it firsthand what these operators actually endure and what the survivors endure. But at the same time, it's just incredibly motivating to see like those first few minutes of freedom and how our aftercare team just is immediately put into motion to start caring for these survivors. So it's something to witness for sure.
I would imagine that lights a fire underneath you where it really kind of gets you amped up with a shot of adrenaline to see this stuff going on firsthand. Like, we're about to make a difference. We're about
Mm-hmm.
to change the lives of so many people and stop this from happening to so many others. Has it ever made you want to get involved on a deeper level? Are you personally able to get involved on a deeper level if you wanted to?
I think I think we all have different skill sets that we bring to the table, right? And
Sure.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to do the things that I'm doing with O.U.R. And I joke all the time that for some reason they gave some kid out of Texas a shot to be a part of the team. And like I said, I come from the business space basically, and practice management and healthcare administration, and most of that is irrelevant to what I do right now, but
Sure.
I see my piece of this, and it definitely creates urgency and motivation for me to do everything I can to get resources downrange. So I'm not at this point looking to do anything else because I think this is how I can best serve the mission. And what one other thing I want to say about that is that I'm not law enforcement trained. I'm not military trained, and most people aren't, right? And so, 3 years ago, I found myself saying, what if I don't have that skill set? What could I possibly do for O.U.R? How could I possibly help this cause? And it took a little bit of investigating to realize that we all play a part, and we draw a lot of ties from the original Underground Railroad. Obviously, with our name, we have an incredible
Sure.
honor and reverence for the original abolitionist. There's a couple that really highlight um, that we really like to highlight because their stories are amazing. One of them is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in
Hmm.
1852. It was written in Cumberland County, Maine, and it was the first widespread publication that actually highlighted the atrocities of slavery, right? And so like just we kind of started our conversation on this, so it's interesting that we circled back, but just like in those days, there's so many parallels. If you lived in the North, you probably knew what slavery was, but you had never really encountered it firsthand. It wasn't necessarily close enough to sort of pull at your heartstrings. But this book changed that. It opened people's eyes to what was actually happening, the atrocities and injustices, and we feel a purpose today to also spread that message so that people can see what's happening to these kids. And that's everybody's responsibility. It's not law enforcement's responsibility. It's not O.U.R.'s responsibility. It's everybody's. And so if there's one call to action that we could kind of walk away from this conversation with, uh, OURrescue.org, there are tons of resources. Get that baseline understanding, watch that documentary, Operation Tucson, understand kind of what's happening, and then help us to activate this country to do something about this and actually make a difference.
Absolutely. I mean, I definitely want to check out Operation Tucson. I mean, I've seen a lot of the stuff that you guys are posting on social media and off your website. But, kind of what you mentioned that you saw that really kind of changed your perspective, made you more aware, and even made you want to get involved more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what was the website again? That would
Yeah, OURrescue.org.
OURrescue.org.
Mm-hmm.
And very soon we're going to be incorporating on the Dadbot Fitness
Yeah.
app an area that people can get involved in as well and help out off the dadbotfitness.com. Off our website will be you can also contribute to the cause here. Well, Gary, I really do appreciate your time today. Um, as you mentioned, it's a dark reality that a lot of people are really, really, really not aware of, and as a parent, as a person, as someone who doesn't want to see others in pain, and kind of leave the world a better place than when we came in. I'd really want to try to spread this message a lot more. A lot of what we set out to do as Dad Bod Fitness is, be the superhero that your kids think you are. Everyone looks up to their dad as being the best and strongest person in the world. Not everybody has that ability to have that father figure, have that superhero in their lives. And what you guys are doing is absolutely that, going in there, swooping in, being able to rescue them and help them for however long they need. It's absolutely, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, man. Thank you for the opportunity, and like I said, thanks for taking ownership of this issue, and I hope we can continue to collaborate and raise awareness and raise resources for this important work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you again, Gary.
Thanks.
All right. Hang tight one sec. It's just